You there? Yes, you. Still scrolling before bed looking for something soft and boring to fall asleep to good. Because I've got stories that smell like old wood stale incense and broken pride. They call me the Old One. But I once rode through deserts in heels sharper than your mother-in-law's tongue. I've seen kings blush in rouge and peasants wear swords with teeth. You think history is clean, proper polite. Let me take your hand, child, and drag you gently through the dust and sweat of the past. Not the kind you read in school. The kind we buried under perfume powder and regret. So go on, blow out the light, pull the blanket up, and listen. I'll show you just how strange being a man used to be, and how piece by piece we gave it all away. You know, the world used to make sense. At least in my time. There was a time when the things we now call feminine were worn, carried, or invented by men. Yeah, let that settle in a bit. In ancient Persia, for example, we wore high heels, not to strut, not to pose. We wore them to survive. You see, cavalrymen needed their heels to hook into the stirrups. Without them, you'd slip mid-charge and, well, let's just say the enemy wouldn't wait for you to get back on the horse. Then, of course, the Europeans saw it, and what do you think they did? They copied it, but made it fancy. Red heels, silk stockings. The French court turned a tool of war into a fashion statement. The higher the heel, the more masculine you were. I'm serious. I wore heels to fight off invaders. You wear them now to match a prom dress. Strange whirl, eh? Now let's talk about bags. Yes, bags. Not the cute ones, not clutches. I'm talking about real bags, made of leather, stitched with bone, decorated with dog teeth, fashionable at the time, apparently. And guess what? The oldest handbag ever found was made for a man. That bag likely held tools, flint, maybe a spare knife. Back then, if a man didn't carry a bag, he probably didn't carry much of a future either. Nowadays, bags are girly. Apparently, only women need to carry things. Fascinating. You want another one. Let's talk pads. Not the kind for writing. You know the ones. During World War I, nurses needed a way to stop soldiers from bleeding out. So they used cellulose bandages, absorbent, disposable, and cheap. And one clever nurse had a thought. What if we use this in underwear? And just like that, the first modern pad was born. From the battlefield, not the beauty aisle. Yet today we hide them in pink packaging, tuck them behind shampoo bottles, and act like they're shameful. War gave us pads, now we're embarrassed to mention them. Funny, right? If this little unraveling of history made you raise an eyebrow, or maybe two, you might want to stick around. Because next, we're talking skirts. And trust me, before women wore them, we ruled in them. Let's talk about skirts, shall we? You seem to think they've always belonged to women. Soft fabric, gentle flow, something delicate, something feminine. Well, let me tell you, back in my day, real men wore skirts. Not for the breeze, though, that was a bonus, but for battle labor ritual and royalty. The Romans had their togas, the Greeks wore chitons, the Scots kilts, and don't you dare call them dresses unless you enjoy a headbutt. Even in Japan, samurai wore hakama flowing pleated skirts tied at the waist, designed to conceal leg movement during sword fights. Now that is strategic fashion. You know what pants were for peasants? Farm work, getting dirty. Skirts were for freedom of movement, of status of elegance. When I stood before the council sword in hand, robes brushing the floor, I didn't feel fragile. I felt immense. Fabric swaying like a banner. Embroidered trim glinting in the firelight. The skirt wasn't feminine, it was formidable. You moved like you owned the room because you probably did. Back then, the wider your silhouette, the more space you were allowed to occupy. And trust me, in politics, space is power. Big sleeves, broad robes, long hems, they told people. This man matters. Step aside. Now we wear suits so tight you can't even breathe and call that confidence. Ridiculous. So when did it change? Flame factories. Industrial work meant flames machinery, sharp spinning things, and let's face it, loose clothing didn't mix well with gears. So trousers became the norm for men. Practical, protective, standardized. And gradually, skirts fell into silence. Left behind in the candlelit halls of kings. Brushed aside in dusty rituals. And eventually, given to women. As if we forgot who wore them first. If you thought skirts were just about fashion, you've only seen the hem. Subscribe, we've got makeup wigs and war paint still to come. You think makeup's a new thing? Let me tell you something. Child makeup has been around longer than most kingdoms. And once upon a time, it was a man's game. In ancient Egypt, black coal wasn't just for the eyes. It was sacred, protection, power, Pharaohs painted their lids before battle not to look pretty, but to channel divine energy, to ward off the evil eye, and maybe just maybe to terrify their enemies with style. In ancient China, the courtmen powdered their faces white, their brows arched like brushstrokes. In Japan, samurai would rouge their cheeks before a duel. Not because they were soft, but because even in death a warrior must look composed. It wasn't vanity, it was armor. Worn not on the body, but on the face. Makeup showed wealth. It showed you had time. It showed you didn't labor under the sun because you could afford pale skin. It said, I don't work the land, I own the land. Back then, men with powdered faces, crimson lips, and beauty marks weren't mocked, they were feared. They ruled kingdoms. But then, then she came along. Queen Victoria. Ah yes, the queen who sipped tea and declared with all the weight of the British Empire makeup is improper, indecent, vulgar. Just like that centuries of pigment ceremony and masculine glory reduced to only for actresses and fallen women. Men wiped their faces. Society rewrote the script, and suddenly, makeup belonged to women. But only quietly, only secretly, and certainly not in polite company. From royal temples to powder rooms, that was the fall. Not of men, but of makeup's meaning. Still think history is black and white stick around. Because next, we're heading into the wigs, and honeymen were the ones who wore them first. Let's talk about wigs. Now I know what you're thinking. Wigs aren't those for theater grannies and pageant queens? No. Wigs were once the crown of kings. And not just metaphorically. I'm talking powdered, curled, sky-high constructions made of horsehair, goat hair, and the pride of entire empires. Back then, a proper man didn't just wear a wig. He wore a statement. Your wig said everything before you even opened your mouth. I am important. I am clean. I have people to brush this thing for me. You see, in the 17th and 18th centuries, wigs weren't costumes. They were daily uniforms. Lawyers, dukes, doctors, kings. Even the executioner at times had a powdered mop on his head just to keep up appearances. Why? Because baldness, the horror, was seen as unmanly, unholy, and above all poor. So men covered it. Not with shame, but with style. Towering, perfumed, perfectly curled symbols of their worth. We wore our wealth on our heads. And the more ridiculous the shape, the higher your social standing. Fashion is funny like that, isn't it? Some wigs were so big they needed support wires underneath. And trust me, lad, when your head tilts just slightly wrong and takes half the candelabra with it, that's when you know you've made it. But then, as always, the pendulum swung back. Wigs became feminine, too artificial, too much trouble, too theatrical. Now they belong to actresses and drag queens. And us. We're stuck with barbers who ask if we want a fade or a buzz cut. We used to wear architecture. Now we settle for number 3 on the sides. Sad, really. History repeats, but only if you let it fade. Let's talk about jewelry. You wear a ring now, people ask. Is it an engagement? A gift? Back in my day, a man wore rings to intimidate. To declare land ownership, to close deals, and occasionally to punch someone in the face with flair. You see, jewelry wasn't decoration, it was language. A gold chain said, I command men. A ruby signet said, I own cities, and if you wore 5 rings on one hand, well, you either ruled a kingdom or you were about to marry into one. In ancient Mesopotamia, kings were buried with hundreds of pieces, necklaces, bangles, amulets, anklets, every inch of their body gilded. Not because they were vain, but because they believed the gods wouldn't recognize you in the afterlife. Unless you looked expensive. Even in medieval Europe, knights wore chains across their chests not for fashion, but to show which family backed them, which fortune they carried into battle. And don't get me started on the Muggles. Their rings had poison compartments. Their belts weighed more than most horses, and their crowns so heavy they could barely nod in conversation. Still, they wore them proudly. Because in those days, if you weren't shining, you were invisible. But then time passed. Minimalism arrived, and suddenly a man wearing a necklace was trying too hard, an earring was too edgy, and a gemstone. Well, now it's her thing. Funny, isn't it? We once walked into courts looking like temples. Now we apologize for wearing a bracelet. We used to blind kings with our collars. Now we settle for a watch, and even that has to be smart. Still think gold is just for weddings. Subscribe next. We're talking perfume and why medieval men wore it not to flirt, but to survive. Let's talk about perfume. Not the kind with celebrity faces and glass bottles. The real stuff. The ancient stuff. The, if I don't wear this, I will offend the gods and everyone around me kind. You see? In medieval times, bathing was, how shall I put this, optional. Water was cold, soap was rare, and diseases. Oh, they loved a good damp armpit. So what did we do? We burned herbs. We rubbed ourselves with resins. We carried scented pomanders around our necks, little metal orbs filled with spices and flowers like a medieval AirPod. But for your nose. The rich didn't bathe, they masked. Layers and layers of scent, cloves, amber, lavender, even vinegar. Men didn't just spray a cologne, they steeped in it. It was survival, not seduction. If you smelled good, you weren't trying to attract. You were trying to say, I am clean. Enough. And in royal courts, the stronger your scent, the more powerful you were. Because if you could afford to drown in jasmine every morning, surely you weren't shoveling dung. Of course things changed. Running water arrived. Showers became daily rituals, and just like that, scent lost its purpose. Perfume became flirtation, romance, a whisper behind the ear, a pulse on the wrist. We forgot it used to be war paint. We forgot it once meant I'm not sick. And now, you wear perfume, and people ask, who are you trying to impress? Well, back in my time, everyone, including Death himself, liked this little trip through scent and smoke. Subscribe, and next, we breathe in the truth about hygiene because medieval men had their own ways of staying fresh, sort of. Let's be honest, cleanliness was not our strongest virtue. We didn't bathe every day. In fact, if you bathed once a season, you were considered ambitious, twice a noble, 3 times suspicious. Baths took time. They took firewood, water, privacy, and frankly, not everyone had those things. So we found other ways, clever, desperate, slightly smoky ways. We rubbed our bodies with ash. Yes, ash, the same stuff left over from the fire. It absorbed oil, killed lice, left you smelling like a slightly overcooked biscuit. We swept herbs into our beds, mint, sage, lavender if you were lucky. Not for romance, but to keep the fleas confused. We changed our linen more than our lives. Because if you couldn't wash your body, you washed the thing that touched it, and hoped for the best. Some slept with onions around the neck. Some chewed parsley to hide the breath of rot. Some believed touching holy relics made them cleaner. And honestly, maybe it did, at least spiritually. And yet, we weren't barbarians. There were bathhouses, warm ones, where people gathered, gossiped, soaked, and shaved. Until the plagues came, and someone whispered, water opens the pores and then lets the disease in. Boom! Bathhouses shut down. Public washing dangerous. Better to stink in safety than smell sweet in a grave. So we covered ourselves in wool, prayed, perfumed, and let the dirt become familiar. Was it perfect? No. Was it human? Very much so. If you followed this long, bless your nose. Subscribe to hear more forgotten truths like these. Because sometimes the dirtiest history is the one most worth remembering. Back in my day, son, we real men wore skirts, and no, we weren't ashamed of it. Not those frilly lace things the noble dandies wore later on. I'm talking thick hand-woven wool skirts heavy enough to knock out a sick sheep if you swung it right. Warm, rugged, and frankly quite convenient, especially when you had to relieve yourself out in the woods. But only when the wind wasn't trying to kill you. That day, me and a bunch of village warriors took our spears and headed north to give some mercenaries a good scare. The enemy was nowhere in sight, but the wind. The wind got there first, howling like my grandma catching someone stealing her chicken eggs. Now mountain wind isn't like the breeze you get out in the rice fields. It doesn't just chill you, it violates you. My skirt puffed out like a sail on a cursed ship. My thighs numb as if someone had tucked a frozen rock right between them. And behind me, it felt like some invisible goblin was flipping my skirt over and over just for fun, then running off cackling. Standing next to me was Old Huyn, the most ancient bastard in the whole squad, and he just muttered, "I'd rather fight a sword than keep mooning the heavens like this." And he was right. The colder it got, the louder everything sounded. Swords clanged sharper. Armor creaked like angry spirits. But nothing. Nothing was louder than the sound of our teeth chattering, like a chorus of dying crickets. Before we even saw a single enemy, half our men turned back, mumbling something about grabbing an extra cloak. Cowards. That left me Old Huang and this fool named San, who thought he was clever wearing 2 skirts for extra warmth. He wrapped himself so tight he couldn't even sit. When it came time to duck behind a boulder, he toppled over like a chopped tree and couldn't get back up. His skirt was cinched so tight around his legs he was basically mummified from the waist down. We never did see the enemy that day, but the wind. The wind beat the living hell out of us. That night I came home silent. Didn't say a word. Hung my skirt by the fire, shook off the frost. Took off my boots, rubbed some herbal liquor on my thighs like a desperate monk. And I swore to myself, next time I go to war, I'll freeze to death before I let a damn skirt betray me again. So you see, kid, history ain't just scrolls and battles and names of kings. Sometimes history is a cold wind ripping through the skirt of a man trying to keep his dignity, while that very skirt tries to flip him into legend. The mushroom that made the whole squad cry face down. Narrated by Old Ba the Medieval, the only man who survived with his guts and dignity intact. Back in the day, we were hungry. And not the poetic kind of hungry like in the old songs. No, I mean real grass smells like soup kind of hungry. Our rations were gone. And our cook. Let's just say if being half blind and half deaf still qualifies as a cook, then sure we had one. He looked at us and said, "Go find your own dinner." So we dragged our freezing butts into the woods, trembling like goats and picking leaves like fools. Then came San, that cursed little weasel. He pointed at a patch of mushrooms. Big purple caps. White speckles, fat and round, looked like birthday cupcakes made by the devil. "Hey, these look just like the ones in fairy tales," he said. Fairy tales, all right. The kind where the main character dies screaming on the forest floor. But food was gone. And San had already munched one like a happy squirrel. So we cooked them up, threw in some salt, and split the pot. Then, like some dark magic trick, hell opened its door. Huyin, the oldest guy in the squad, jumped up like lightning eyes wide. "She's back, my wife. She's dancing in the treetops." Bin He started laughing. Not a happy laugh, no. It was more like a ghost just tickled my intestines laugh. And Sandy sat down stroking his own foot, cradling it like a baby. He called it my little darling. And me, I hit the moss, face first. Felt like my guts were being wrung out by a mad ox with vengeance in its hooves. We were no longer a war band. Just a circle of grown men lying face down in the dirt, sobbing like toddlers who lost their moms at the market. Nobody died that night, but our dignity sure didn't make it. Next morning, we staggered back to camp pale, broken, and oddly quiet. And from that day forward, I carved 3 rules into the stone of my soul. The prettier the mushroom, the deadlier the plan. Never, and I mean never let San near the food. Always sit close to a bush, just in case. Evacuation is needed. So you see, child war isn't just swords and blood. Sometimes the deadliest killer in the woods is a plump little mushroom smiling up at you with the eyes of Satan and the taste of betrayal. It was long boring, and everyone secretly hated each other. We'd gather in the great hall draped in velvet and powdered and crushed herbs, trying not to sweat through 3 layers of nobility. There'd be music, sure. Maybe a troubadour singing about doomed lovers, or a knight who killed a dragon and cried about it afterward. But no one was listening. Everyone was watching. Watching who sat where, who bowed first, who whispered to whom. One wrong look and suddenly the whole room thinks you're planning a coup with the kitchen maid. And smiling. Oh, you had to smile. Even when your corset was slicing you in half and someone next to you smelled like bad cheese and betrayal. I once smiled for so long my cheek twitched for 2 hours afterward. But heaven forbid you frown, because that meant scandal, pregnancy, or heresy. Possibly all 3. The conversations were torture. You couldn't say anything real, just endless loops of how lovely your tunic is. Oh, your lordship's falcon was so majestic yesterday. Isn't the weather just divinely obedient today? And behind each comment, a hidden jab. Lovely tunic meant you spent too much money. Majestic falcon meant we all saw it miss the rabbit. Obedient weather, I hope your crops fail. And heaven help you if you laughed at the wrong moment. I once just chuckled at a joke about a bishop's wig. For a week, no one spoke to me without clutching a rosary. I had to write an apology letter to a hat. The court was political theater in tight clothing and worse lighting. Every gesture was a message. Every silence a warning. Every compliment a trap wrapped in silk. And yet I played the part. I curtsied. I nodded. I raised my goblet and toasted people I'd rather see trip into the moat. Because that's what queens do. We sit through the performance. And we do it in heels. People love to imagine royal romance as some sweeping candlelit affair. Silk sheets, flirtatious glances across the feast table, secret kisses in the garden. No, try obligation awkwardness and the distinct scent of goat cheese sweat. Here's the reality: royal marriages were contracts with crowns on top. Henry and I weren't soulmates, we were strategic assets. I was young, politically valuable, and inconveniently opinionated. He was ambitious, irritable, and smelled vaguely like a wet fireplace. Romance, please. There was a schedule. Yes, an actual schedule approved by clergy for when and how often we should unite for the good of the realm. It was written in Latin just in case you wanted your sex life to feel extra spiritual and profoundly unsexy. We did it out of duty, sometimes out of curiosity, occasionally out of mild affection, mostly because a steward outside the door was tracking productive nights. The beds were squeaky, the room was drafty, the candles sputtered like they were judging us, and the whole time you're thinking, is this how future monarchs are made? Yes, apparently. Privacy was optional, so was pleasure. And don't even get me started on the aftermath. The questioning stares, the whispered prayers, the linen inspections. Like we just completed a sacred ritual and not, human biology. And if I ever said no, that made me a sinner, a bad wife, a threat to the royal bloodline, because God forbid a queen wants some space and a hot drink instead of a royal performance under pressure. Of course I played along. I smiled. I bore children. I fulfilled my sacred feminine duty. But love came in brief moments. Between politics, between pregnancies, in the quiet glances when no one else was watching. Henry wasn't a bad man. He was just medieval. Raised on swords and scripture and the belief that a woman's silence was her virtue. But I was never very quiet, and I was never just his. If you've ever imagined medieval childbirth as a glowing candlelit miracle, let me stop you right there. Try a wooden birthing chair. Boiling water no one actually uses. A priest pacing outside the door. And the overwhelming sense that half the people in the room are more worried about your soul than your cervix. Let's start with the chair. It wasn't a bed. Oh no, beds were for the dead. Labor happened on a carved wooden chair with a giant hole in the middle and 2 handles you could grip while screaming your ancestral lineage into the ceiling. Pain relief laughs in Latin. We had herbs, sometimes wine, but mostly we had women. Mothers, midwives, wet nurses, all yelling over each other with advice like, breathe deep. Don't breathe too much. Push like St. Margaret is watching. Meanwhile, the priest is outside praying for my safe passage into either heaven or motherhood, whichever came first. And of course, there's the crown. Not the one on my head. The baby's crown. The moment the midwife yells, I see the head, and suddenly everyone starts weeping and crossing themselves like I just summoned the second coming. Let me be clear, it was bloody. It was loud. It was terrifying. And that's if things went well. If they didn't, you bled. You tore. You died. Or worse, the baby died and you lived, and then you spent the rest of your royal life being told it was God's punishment for pride or fasting on a Tuesday. I gave birth 10 times. 10. And each time the room was packed with more worry than warmth. People whispered prayers, not comfort. Every breath I took was a risk, every silence a sign. I wasn't a mother, yet I was a walking vessel of dynasty. And if the child lived... Congratulations now. Hand them to a wet nurse and go sit through mass while your body feels like it's been ripped apart by divine intention. Was there joy? Yes, but it was buried under blood, sweat, incense, and centuries of expectation. So no childbirth wasn't magical. It was medieval. You'd think that after surviving childbirth, a queen might get a moment to breathe. Ha! No, you're not a woman, you're a symbol. And symbols don't get rest. After giving birth, I wasn't ushered into comfort. I was led into confinement. 40 days. Minimum. Locked away in a cold stone chamber with no visitors except priests, midwives, and the occasional pigeon that slipped in through the window slit. They called it churching. I called it being exiled while bleeding from places people refused to name out loud. The idea was that I needed purification. Because apparently giving life meant I'd become spiritually dirty. So I sat in silence, wrapped in wool, dripping, aching, mourning things I wasn't allowed to grieve. If the baby lived, they took it away immediately, handed to wet nurses wrapped in cloth, whisked to the nursery like I was just the delivery service, not the mother. If the baby didn't live, silence. No ceremony, no holding. Just a priest, a candle, and a quiet implication that God has his reasons. I cried. Not openly, of course. Queens don't do that. I wept into linens, into pillows, into empty sleeves. And when I bled too much, they blamed my sins. When I bled too little, they blamed my womb. My body had just built a human being from scratch, and yet somehow it was still seen as a failure or worse, a scandal. And let's not forget the superstitions. I wasn't allowed to step outside before being blessed. Wasn't allowed to touch iron. Was told that if I looked in a mirror, I might reflect death back into the child. Yes, really. Meanwhile, my back ached, my breasts leaked, and every seat in the castle felt like punishment. But I smiled when the nobles came to visit. I bowed my head when the priest gave thanks. I nodded gracefully when someone whispered, "You're strong, your grace." No, I wasn't strong. I was wounded and exhausted in a gown that still smelled of sweat and smoke. But in the Middle Ages, that was the job: bleed quietly, smile politely, and always make sure the heir survives. Faith was everywhere, carved into walls, etched into rings, sewn into the hem of every gown I wore. I couldn't take a single step, not through a hallway, not across a courtyard, not even toward my own child, without stepping through some invisible fog of guilt, reverence, and whispered judgment. God, they said, watched everything, which meant I never truly walked alone. I was followed by saints' shadows and suspicious glances. I prayed, of course. Twice before sunrise. Once before I ate. Anytime anything went wrong, which as queen meant constantly. But my prayers were quiet. Not because I lacked devotion, but because everything I really wanted to say felt like heresy. I wanted to ask why children died. Why women bled. Why prayers went unanswered while tyrants kept winning wars and bishops kept building bigger palaces. But you don't ask those things not out loud. Not if you want to stay on the throne. So we did what queens do. We performed piety like theater. We kissed relics, donated churches, fasted during festivals, smiled during sermons that blamed Eve for every terrible thing since the apple. But in the quiet hours behind closed chapel doors, I wrestled with something else. Not God, but the idea of him. The way men used him to punish, to silence, to shame. A man could slaughter peasants and be blessed for it. I questioned a tax policy and suddenly I'm a threat to divine order. And so I wore my faith like a cloak. Visible, elegant, respectable. But underneath torn seams. And unanswered prayers. Dear me, the younger me. The barefoot girl racing through vineyards, wild-haired, loud-laughed, too curious for her own safety. You wanted everything. And in a way you got it. The crown, the courts, the alliances, the gowns, the applause. You got the poems written for you. The legends etched in stained glass. The world bowed to you, sort of. But let me tell you what else you'll get. You'll get stared at constantly. Judged not for who you are, but for what you symbolize. You'll be told to be quiet for peace. To dress modestly for respect. To bear children for legacy. To smile for the realm. And you will do it. You'll survive kings, crusades, betrayal, childbirth. You'll outlive lovers and rumors and the sound of your own name being dragged through court corridors. But you'll lose things too. Your voice some days, your body piece by piece. The right to grief in public. The right to be angry without being punished. You'll be locked in a tower by the man you once held hands with in gardens. You'll eat alone. Pray alone. And sometimes be forgotten entirely. But listen to me now. You will still write. You will still rule. You will plant ideas that outlive empires. You will raise sons who will rule not just kingdoms but stories. And in quiet moments just before dawn or while brushing your hair with shaking hands, you'll still be that girl. The one who asked too many questions. The one who wanted everything. I didn't forget you. I became you. And I carried you even when no one else could see. Love your older self. Your queen, your witness. People remember the crown. They remember the marriages, the wars, the sons, the scandals. They remember my name Eleanor carved into chronicles, sung in ballads, whispered in sermons about difficult women. But do they remember me? The girl who rode horses without a saddle. The woman who read Latin by candlelight and negotiated with kings like they were merchants at market. The mother who wept over cradles and coffins, often in the same year. History trims the edges. It files down the noise. It takes your jagged life and smooths it into a timeline, neat, forgettable, distant. But I was not neat, and I was never forgettable. I loved men who disappointed me. I raised sons who betrayed me. I ruled kingdoms that feared me. And I endured churches that tried to erase me. I was queen. But I was also prisoner. I was mother, widow, rival, and rumor. I was the reason a crown changed hands, and the excuse when things fell apart. But through it all, the births, the blood, the banquets, the betrayals, I stayed. I watched empires shift beneath my feet. I watched my children turn into kings and my lovers turn into ghosts. I outlived enemies, allies, and almost everything else. And still I'm here. Not in marble, not in stained glass, but in every woman who asks too many questions, who takes up too much space, who wears her ambition like armor, and who refuses to be quiet when quiet is all that's asked of her. So when you hear my name, don't just remember the queen. Remember the woman, because I was many things, and above all, I was never gone. If you think medieval noblewomen spent their days sipping wine, embroidering curtains, and gently sighing at windowsills, you haven't met Jeanne de Clisson. Or, as history eventually called her, the Lioness of Brittany. Now that name might sound majestic, fierce even. But no one earns a title like that for looking good on horseback. You get it when the kingdom takes everything from you. And you decide to take something back. Jeanne was born into privilege. The kind of upbringing where priests bowed before breakfast and your wine had a family crest. She married twice. First husband died young. Second one was Olivier de Clisson. Strong hands, quiet temper. Not a fan of royal games, which as it turns out made him dangerous. They had children, 5 actually. The kind of family you protect at all costs, especially when the court starts sniffing around. And then came the letter. Olivier was summoned to Paris. Routine questioning, they said. Just a few concerns about some military losses. He promised to be home by week's end. He wasn't. What came home instead was his head. Boxed. Salted. Nailed to the gates of Nantes, not by criminals, but by the crown. No trial, no explanation, just royal justice, quiet, brutal final. Now here's where most stories about noble women end. Tears may be a discreet retreat to a convent. Not Jeanne. What followed next was not grief. It was something colder, sharper. She didn't break down, she broke ranks. She dropped the lace and the lineage. Dropped the title. Dropped the silence. She didn't just mourn her husband, she made a list. A real one. Names, ships, ports, targets. Because this story, it doesn't end with a widow at a funeral. It begins with a mother sharpening her fury. If this were a movie, that scene, the moment she puts the last candle out in her prayer room and walks into the dark, would be where the score drops. Because from this moment forward, Jeanne de Clisson stopped being a lady of the court and became a storm in black sails. Every great revenge story has a turning point. For Jeanne de Clisson, it wasn't the moment her husband was taken. It wasn't even the letter from Paris, cold and formal, asking him to clarify matters of loyalty. No, the turning point was a wooden box. Inside was Olivier's head, pickled, sealed, and delivered like some royal invoice. The French crown didn't even bother with ceremony. They just nailed it to the city gate of Nantes. That's how Jeanne found out her husband was dead. Not through a messenger, not through a priest, but by walking through the city and seeing his eyes lifeless, glassy, staring back at her from a wall. If this were a movie, this scene would be shot in silence. No dramatic strings. Just the sound of market chatter fading as Jeanne turns, sees the spike, and realizes what's nailed to it. There's no record of what she said. Some historians claim she collapsed. Others say she stood still, then turned around and walked home without a word. The truth, we'll never know. But what we do know is this: she didn't scream, she didn't faint, she didn't pray, she remembered. And from that moment on, the woman who used to arrange flowers for Sunday Mass started arranging something else entirely. Vengeance. The nobility whispered that she'd lost her mind. But no, Jeanne hadn't lost her mind. She'd lost her patience, her faith, her tolerance for crowns that played judge and executioner in secret. She stopped attending court, stopped entertaining, stopped pretending her sons would grow up safe if she just kept quiet. That's the terrifying thing about women like Jean. They don't start wars the way men do with drums and declarations. They do it the slow way, the smart way, the way that waits until the crown's not looking. And then they strike. What the French monarchy didn't know was that they hadn't silenced a widow. They had created something, and she was just getting started. This is the part of the movie where the camera pans over a stormy harbor. Jeanne stands on the dock no longer in morning black, but in something sharper. Her face is calm, her eyes focused. The soft noblewoman has vanished. Because when the crown takes everything from you and the church tells you to forgive, and your friends quietly disappear, you don't light candles. You light torches. And Jeanne, she sold it all. The estates, the jewels, every silk gown stitched for court, even the heirlooms passed down by generations of obedient women. She stripped her life bare down to the bones and used every coin to build something the French crown would never see coming. 3 warships. Not carriages, not convents. Ships! She had them painted completely black. No royal crests, no family sigils. Just black wood black sails and a red flag that didn't stand for any nation. It stood for revenge. She didn't recruit knights or noble warriors. She recruited men with scars, disgraced soldiers, hungry mercenaries, sailors who had nothing to lose and everything to burn. They didn't call her captain. They called her Lady Hell, because she paid in gold but made them swear in blood. Her sons came with her. Not all one was too young. But her eldest, Olivier Jr., stood by her side as she watched her first ship leave the harbor. If this was a scene, you'd hear the creak of the ropes, the groan of timber, and Jean's voice cutting through it all. We do not pray for peace, we hunt those who stole it. And just like that, Brittany's noble widow became a ghost story. Because the French coast was no longer safe. Not for royal ships, not for noble cargo, not for anyone wearing the wrong flag. If you thought Jean was bluffing, you'd be dead by now. Her black ships didn't just cruise the coast, they haunted it. They called it the Black Fleet. 3 vessels quiet as shadow, fast as judgment. They didn't dock at ports, they waited offshore, watching, listening, choosing. Because Jeanne wasn't just attacking the French Navy. She was hunting something more personal. Names. Every noble merchant or official tied to Olivier's execution was added to her ledger. Not for trial, not for ransom, but for destruction. The red flag didn't ask for mercy, and Jean didn't offer it. She didn't just sink ships, she boarded them. Steal first, questions never. If this were a movie, you'd see it like this. A calm sea at dusk. A French vessel returning from trade. Suddenly silence breaks. Out of the mist, 3 ships black as morning cloth closing in. No herald, no warning, no survivors. The crew would try to fight. They always did. But Jean's men weren't fighting for glory. They were fighting like orphans, like widows, like people with nothing left to lose. And that's the kind of crew that never blinks when the order comes to burn it all. They say Jeanne watched from the deck cloak, whipping in the wind, hand on sword, silent, steady, and exacting. She never smiled. This wasn't about joy. This was about balance. For every head that rolled without justice, she sent a mast to the bottom of the sea. For every royal lie, she left behind smoke on the horizon. And slowly word spread. Sailors began calling her fleet something else. La flotte de la vengeance, the fleet of vengeance. Because it wasn't piracy, it was a message. And everyone from Brittany to Bordeaux was finally starting to read it. Now you'd think the French crown would panic. 3 black ships circling their waters. Noble blood spilled on their own trade routes. A widow with a war fleet and nothing left to lose. Surely the king would rally an armada. Surely Paris would thunder with decrees and gallows and vengeance. But here's the twist, they said nothing. Not a word, not a proclamation, not even a whisper of blame. Because silence, you see, is how royalty hides a mistake. The death of Olivier de Clisson had been a political theater. A message swift and brutal to frighten others into obedience. But Jeanne had flipped the script. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't begging. She was burning ships. And the crown, it did what all-powerful cowards do when the curtain slips. It pretended nothing was wrong. If this were a film, this is the part where we cut to the royal court. Golden hallways, velvet robes, a bored king swirling wine as his ministers shuffle nervously. Sire, there are rumors. Rumors are for peasants. We have diplomacy. Diplomacy. Jean was out at sea dismantling it plank by plank. And the nobles, they grew nervous. Because if the king could have Olivier executed without trial, And if his widow could come back as a phantom of revenge, then the entire illusion of control was cracking. Even worse, Jeanne was winning hearts. Fishermen fed her crew in secret. Villagers along the coast whispered prayers not to the church, but to the Black Fleet. Not everyone feared her. Some cheered, because Jeanne wasn't just avenging her husband. She was avenging every broken oath, every peasant taxed into starvation, every lie dressed in silk. She had become something more dangerous than a rebel. She had become a symbol, and symbols once lit are hard to put out. Not every story Jeanne left behind was written in blood. Some were written in silence. Because while Jeanne was carving her vengeance across the channel, someone else was watching, learning. Her son, Olivier Jr. Most pirate stories don't feature children, but this one does. Because Jeanne didn't lock her grief in a tower. She brought it to sea, and her son grew up with the scent of salt fire and retribution. Imagine it, a boy standing barefoot on the deck of a ship. His hands too small to lift a sword, but old enough to remember his father's face. And what the king did to it. He didn't cry. Jeanne wouldn't have stopped him if he did, but he didn't. Instead, he watched. He listened. And every time a French vessel went up in flames, that boy learned a lesson not taught in noble halls. Power, his mother told him once, is not inherited. It's built plank by plank in the wreckage of what they tried to take from you. And she meant it, because Jeanne wasn't raising a prince. She was forging something harder. A survivor. He saw what loyalty cost. What silence cost more. He saw how his mother never begged, only prepared. Never asked, only acted. And the sea became his education. There were no tutors on the Black Fleet. Only sailors with scarred knuckles and a mother who taught him to read wind before he read scripture. And as the boy grew, so did the shadow behind him. People began to whisper not just about Jeanne, but about her son. Because the boy who watched the sea burn, one day he'd walk into a war of his own. But that's a story for later. Right now, in this moment, aboard a ship painted black, under a sky full of smoke, he is just a boy. But soon, he won't be. Every legend has its limit. Even vengeance. For 5 years, the Black Fleet roamed the sea like a ghost with a grudge. French captains whispered Jeanne's name like it was a curse. Children were told, behave or the lioness will come. And sometimes she did. She stormed galleons. She burned convoys. She vanished into fog before the king could even say her name out loud. But here's the thing about fire. It consumes everything. Even the person who lit the match. Because while Jeanne's ships ruled the channel, her body wore thin. And behind every cheer in the village, behind every whispered prayer, there was something else. Exhaustion. You don't chase ghosts forever. And Jeanne, she had become one. Not in name and life. She didn't sleep. She didn't laugh. She kept sailing because stopping meant remembering. And remembering meant breaking. If this were a film, this is the scene you'd see. Late at night, Jeanne alone on deck. Wind snapping her cloak. She holds her husband's dagger not to use just to feel the weight of it. Her son older now watching from the shadows. Wanting to ask if they're done. Too afraid to hear the answer. Because when you live on revenge long enough, you forget what peace tastes like. And somewhere in Jeanne's eyes, that hunger had gone cold. They say she started sailing less, started docking more. The black paint on the ships faded, and for the first time in years, the sea fell silent. Some say the king finally struck a deal with her. Others say her body gave out before her sword did. But one thing is certain, the lioness didn't die screaming. She left her final message without a single word. She simply stopped, and for a woman who made silence bleed, that was louder than any war drum. The warships faded, the sea calmed. The lioness disappeared. But legends don't end when the sails drop. They echo, because Jeanne de Clisson didn't just make enemies. She made questions. Where did she go? Why did she stop? And who, if anyone, dared to follow her? History, the official kind, doesn't tell us. She simply vanishes from the records. No death date, no grand funeral, not even a footnote with closure. Just silence. But not the kind that fades. The kind that lingers. Because long after the last black ship left the water, Jeanne's name still whispered through the French countryside. Not as a villain, not as a pirate, but as something harder to define, a woman who dared. And if this were a film, this is the montage scene. A seamstress in Bordeaux quietly stitches a lion into the lining of her dress. A fisherman near Nantes teaches his son to tie knots the old way like Jeanne's crew did. A young noblewoman reads a hidden letter smuggled unsigned that ends with one word, courage. That was Jani's final act. Not revenge, not destruction, but example. She'd lived through fire and left behind the blueprint for defiance. And her son, he didn't inherit the fleet. He inherited the choice. Whether to stay in the ashes of his mother's war or become something different. That's the power of stories like Jean's. They don't wrap up with bows. They don't end when the swords drop. They settle in the bones. They rattle behind closed doors. They make you ask, what would I have done if they nailed my love to a gate? If they silenced my name, would I stay quiet? That's the echo Jana left behind. And history, it still hasn't answered it. Long after the Black Fleet stopped sailing, one shadow still moved with purpose. Olivier, her son. He was no longer a boy watching ships burn. Now he was a man, and the world still broken, still sharp. But Olivier didn't carry his mother's rage. Not exactly. He carried the silence that came after. While the French court quietly erased her from their scrolls, Olivier carved his own place in stone, steel, and battle scars. They didn't call him a pirate. They called him Marshal of France. Yes, that France. The same kingdom that nailed his father's head to the gates. The same crown his mother hunted through storms. He served it, not out of loyalty, not out of peace, but because some legacies aren't fire, they're fuse. He knew exactly what his mother had done. He never spoke of it, never had to. But every decision he made in court and war echoed the woman who raised him. He refused cowardice. He bent to no nobleman's pride. And when enemies crossed him, they didn't just lose. They vanished. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about memory, about never letting them forget. Even the king had to admit Olivier de Clisson fought like someone who had already lost everything. And that kind of man, you don't control him. You just watch where he points his sword. Jean had shown the world what fury looked like. Her son showed them what it became when it learned to wait. He outlived kings. He commanded armies. He raised his own sons to know the smell of salt and iron. And through it all, he never wore the lion. But he didn't have to, because some emblems don't live on banners. They live in blood. Jean de Clisson never got a statue. No crown, no anthem. Not even a grave with her name carved bold. But here's the truth. No monarch wants in their archives. She never vanished, not really. Because women like Jean don't live in marble. They live in stories. In warnings whispered across seaports. In symbols painted on hidden shields. In the way a daughter learns to raise her chin and not ask permission. France tried to erase her. The church tried to silence her. But she'd already slipped beyond their reach. They couldn't bury what refused to kneel. And centuries later, something strange happened. People started asking about her. Not the kings, not the saints. Her. Not because she was gentle, but because she was furious and dared to survive anyway. In dusty libraries, her name resurfaced in margins. In old sailors' songs, a line would echo. Black sails, red flags, and fire in her heart. Every few generations, someone rediscovers her, usually when the world forgets what fury looks like in a woman's hands. And what's most remarkable, she never asked to be remembered. She didn't brand herself a legend, didn't pose for paintings, didn't leave behind manifestos or memoirs. She just acted and left history to chase her shadow. So when people say history is written by the victors, they're right mostly. But sometimes, it's haunted by the ones that tried to erase. And Jean de Clisson, she still sails not on water anymore, but in every girl who refuses to be quiet. In every mother who learns to lead through grief. In every story that dares to say, she did not ask for mercy, and she did not wait for permission. So maybe she was never meant to be remembered. Not in the way kings are remembered with coin statues and rewritten glory. He was just a child when the pain began, but it wasn't pain in the way most people understood it. It started with a simple fall. Baldwin had been wrestling with another boy roughhousing as boys do when his tutor noticed something strange. Baldwin didn't flinch when he scraped his arm on stone. He didn't yelp. He didn't cry. He didn't feel it at all. That was the first sign. The numbness. Not fear, not agony, just the absence of pain. It was the kind of thing only a trained eye would catch, and his tutor William of Tyre was that kind of man. He wrote about it later with the kind of careful dread only someone who had seen too much could manage. He didn't name the disease immediately, but in that moment, history changed. Because Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, heir to a throne son of the ruling class of Outremer, wasn't just a prince anymore. He was a boy with leprosy, and in the 12th century that wasn't just a diagnosis. It was a death sentence delivered by God's own silence. But here's the thing, Baldwin didn't fold. He didn't weep in a chapel or vanish into sickbeds. He kept writing, kept learning. His bones ached, his skin cracked. Sometimes he bled in secret, but he never let it show. People would later say he was brave. But it wasn't bravery, not exactly. It was something colder, something sharper. It was awareness. A kind of clarity that most boys never have. Baldwin knew early that life wasn't going to carry him gently. So he didn't wait to be carried. He studied harder. He listened more. He learned how power works, how men circle around weakness like wolves. And he learned how to stop bleeding even when he couldn't feel the cut. The court didn't talk about it, not openly. No one dared name what was happening to the king's son. But behind every bowed head and reverent nod was one question whispered in stone halls and dark chambers. How long will he last? But Baldwin had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to last. He was going to rule. And that difference. That's where the real story begins. His hands betrayed him first. The fingers stiffened. The joints swelled. Some mornings he couldn't grip a quill without it trembling. Other days his robe clung to open sores along his back. Silent evidence that his skin had begun to rot faster than his legacy ever would. But his mind, that was another story entirely. While his flesh weakened, his intellect caught fire. It wasn't just that Baldwin was clever, it was that he was ruthless about being prepared. He devoured strategy the way others devoured gossip. Read until his eyes burned. Memorized maps dynasties' trade routes. He could debate philosophy in Latin 1 hour and predict troop movements the next. Even his enemies admitted it. He wasn't the kind of prince you kept around out of pity. He was the kind of prince who could outthink a council of grown men, and often did. They called him precocious, but that word barely scratched the surface. Precocious implies charm. Baldwin was steel behind silk, and he had to be, because while the nobles whispered behind his back, wondering how long his body would hold up, Baldwin was already drafting laws, reviewing grain levies, learning who smiled too quickly and who never blinked. He learned how to spot ambition before it turned into betrayal. A skill that would come in handy. More than once. Some envied his birthright, others pitied his disease, but most feared his clarity. He could look at a man once and know exactly what he wanted, and he never forgot it. One diplomat from Byzantium called him the boy who listens like a man with nothing to lose. That wasn't quite right. Baldwin had something to lose, everything. But that's what made him dangerous. He knew the kingdom didn't need a body that could march for miles. It needed a mind that never wavered. And in that quiet space between pain and precision, Baldwin ruled. No one saw the ulcers under his sleeves. No one heard the muffled groans when his joints locked during council meetings. No one knew that he practiced writing each morning with a hand that barely held shape. All they saw was a young king who never flinched, who answered war with reason, who reminded them with every decision that decay doesn't equal defeat. They crowned him young, just 13, too young to vote in most kingdoms. Old enough, apparently, to hold a throne. The coronation was held at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Jerusalem's heart, echoing with incense gold and hollow reverence. The choir sang. Nobles bowed. The crown was set upon his head with trembling hands. They called it sacred, but Baldwin knew better. The crown wasn't holy, it was heavy. Heavy in a way that cracked something in his neck, and something deeper in his chest. They dressed him in white robes. Ceremonial, spotless. But under the layers, his skin wept, silently bandaged tight where it had blistered the week before. No one spoke of it. No one dared. They spoke of divine right instead, of God's will, of legacy. And behind every long live, the king was the quiet, unspoken clause while he lasts. The court smiled for him, but watched him like a sunset beautiful, but clearly on its way down. Even his allies counted his reign in months, not years. Every handshake was a prelude. Every blessing a eulogy in disguise. But Baldwin didn't blink. If they expected a ceremonial child, they were about to meet a strategist in a dying shell. He sat through hours of ritual with a spine of steel and lips that barely moved. He watched the bishops, the barons, the foreign envoys. He cataloged them like pieces on a chessboard, not with malice, but with cool understanding. Because Baldwin wasn't just trying to rule, he was trying to buy time. Time to secure peace. Time to push back against Saladin, time to outpace the rot in his own bones. And above all time to find someone strong enough to take the kingdom when he no longer could. But that part, that would prove harder than any war. The thing about thrones is that they're never empty for long. And Baldwin's crown, radiant as it looked, had already begun to scourge. Not just from the gold pressing into his skull, but from the weight of a kingdom held together by a boy king, with splintering fingers and no room left to fall. Maybe Jean de Clisson was meant for something else. To be felt, like salt in the air before a storm, like the silence before a scream. She didn't ask for legacy. She became one in spite of it all. Not because she won every battle in it, but because she chose not to vanish after losing everything. And the sea, it never gave her back. Because women like Jean don't return to shore. They become tide. They become wind. They become a name that still makes powerful men uneasy when spoken too loudly. So tonight, if the water feels a little colder, if the waves crash just a little harder, remember she's still out there. That's how bad things were. Perfume wasn't for luxury. It was for survival. Here's a weird historical tidbit. Some doctors believed that bad smells or miasmas caused disease, which technically is half right. They didn't know about bacteria, but they knew the air itself was cursed. The solution: carry a pomander, a ball, filled with herbs on your belt near your nose. Or just avoid breathing. And remember that you're not alone. Everyone smells. The priest, the baker, the town crier, even the king. Especially the king who wears velvet over old sweat. Society has simply agreed not to notice, except for the occasional bath-loving eccentric. King Louis XIV, for instance, allegedly bathed about twice in his life. But hey, he wore perfume. Problem solved? You finish emptying your bucket. You glance down the road and see your neighbor also dumping hers. You wave. She nods. It's a moment of community. A shared experience. A badge of mutual suffering. You walk back inside. Your hands are freezing. Your sleeves are wet. And you realize something. You still haven't had breakfast. Back inside your single-room universe of damp wood and communal breathing, the scent of something cooking greets you. You're not sure if that's a good thing yet. The smell is earthy, smoky, faintly sour. You hope it's food, but with medieval kitchens, there's always a chance it's just a rat that ran too close to the hearth. Your mother ladles something into a wooden bowl. She doesn't ask if you're hungry, because of course you are. Everyone is. Always. She hands you a steaming portion of pottage, the eternal medieval dish that's less a recipe and more a concept. Today's version looks like mashed sadness, watery beige, and filled with unidentifiable chunks. A turnip, a bean, the ghost of a cabbage. No one knows. You sit on a wooden stool that wobbles like it's thinking of retiring. You have one spoon. It's wooden like everything else and carved by your grandfather, probably with his teeth. You share it with at least one sibling. You've become very skilled at not making eye contact while swapping saliva. You take a bite. It's lukewarm. It tastes like yesterday's dinner. Which makes sense because it is yesterday's dinner. Also last Thursday's. Pottage never ends, it just regenerates. Like a horrible stew-based phoenix. And the bread. It's more of a challenge than a food. Thick, dark, and crusty enough to crack teeth, it contains bits of straw grit and occasionally ground bark or sawdust, cheaper fillers to stretch the flour supply. Some loaves even have bits of ground clay or iron oxide to give the illusion of being rich and hearty. Your molars tremble at the thought. There's no butter, no jam, no anything, just bread and hope. You wash it down with beer. Yes, beer for breakfast. And no, this isn't some weekend bottomless brunch indulgence. This is your hydration plan. The water from the village well is possibly blessed, but also possibly fatal. It carries everything from bacteria to rotting leaves to traces of livestock. Boiling it is impractical. Filtering it, not even a fantasy. But beer brewed weak and fast kills the germs. It's flat warm and tastes like damp bread, but it won't kill you. Probably. Even children drink it. Your little brother is sipping from a cup that looks more like a carved gourd. He burps contentedly. That's hydration 1327 style. Sometimes if your family's lucky or someone's goat just gave birth, you'll have a bit of milk. But don't count on it. Most of the dairy is turned into cheese or butter and sold off. And milk spoils fast. There's no fridge. There's no keep refrigerated. There's just drink it now or regret it later. Your meal lasts about 6 minutes. There's no lingering, no chatting, no digesting. You eat quickly, quietly, and then return the bowl to the side shelf. Washing dishes means wiping it with a crust of bread, or maybe dipping it in the community rinse bucket, which is more of a bacteria spa. Breakfast is done. You're now fueled by approximately 340 calories of starch and desperation. Let's talk a moment about nutrition. Spoiler, it's bad. Your diet is 80% carbs, 10% boiled leaves, and 10%. I really hope this isn't mold. You're chronically malnourished. Scurvy, welcome. Rickets, you and half the village. Vitamin D deficiency. It's like a family heirloom. Once in a while, if there's a festival or your lord is feeling generous, you might get meat. Not often, and not the good parts. You'll get organs. Maybe some boiled feet. Maybe something gelatinous and gray that used to moo. But usually it's pottage. Always pottage. Forever pottage. Historians still debate whether this was a deliberate dietary strategy or just the result of never-ending food insecurity. Either way, it's a slow march toward digestive surrender. Sometimes your family adds a wild herb to the mix. Nettles, dandelion greens, maybe even garlic if someone made a trade. These add flavor and pretend they're healthy, but they don't fool your stomach. You'll be hungry again in an hour. Here's a weird historical footnote. Some medieval folk believed certain foods had humorous bodily elements that governed health. Too much hot, moist food. Bad for balance. Cold, dry food. Might give you melancholy, so your pottage might be more than sad, it could be medically sad. You glance at the hearth. It's smoking badly. The chimney, if you can call a hole in the roof, a chimney doesn't draw properly. Your eyes water. Your clothes trap the smoke like it's a souvenir. By noon, you'll smell like a fireplace with abandonment issues. And don't even ask about spices. Spices are for the rich, salt. Maybe if you traded eggs. Pepper. You might as well ask for unicorn horn. Nutmeg and cinnamon are basically currency. You've never even seen them. You've only heard of the idea of flavor. You stand. Your legs crack. Your stomach growls already. Breakfast was not satisfying. It was survival. That's all any meal is here. You chew to live, not to enjoy. And yet, somehow there's a comfort to the ritual. The warmth of the hearth, the shared struggle, the soft sound of someone slurping their fourth turnip in the corner. It's miserable, yes, but it's also life. You breathe out slowly and think, okay, maybe it won't get worse. Spoiler, it absolutely will. You finish scraping the last of the pottage from your bowl and reach for your cloak. Not because it's fashionable, it's not, but because the wind outside is about to do terrible things to your bones. The sun is still low. Your breath fogs the air, and now it's time to face the world in your only outfit. That's right, you own one set of clothes. One. It's not for style, it's not for comfort, it's for function, and barely that. You slip on your rough-spun wool tunic, which is stiff from yesterday's smoke sweat and goat slobber. Then your hose basically leg sacks tied with rope. They sag around your knees like disappointed laundry. Your cloak. It's thick, heavy, and smells like wet barn, because that's where you store it on the barn hook next to the tools. It's woven from wool that scratches your skin like sandpaper. There's no lining, no fasteners. You just clutch it closed like a cold tortilla trying to hold its fillings in place. And that's it. No socks, no underwear. No shoes unless you're lucky, or headed to church. In summer, you go barefoot. In winter, you wrap your feet in scraps of cloth and whisper a prayer to Saint No Toes. You glance around the room. Everyone else is bundling up too. Your younger brother pulls on his too short tunic, which used to be yours, and now reveals more leg than medieval modesty strictly allows. Your father shrugs on a leather jerkin patched so many times it's held together by faith alone. Your mother has braided her hair and tied a scarf over it, both to show modesty and to keep lice from jumping ship mid-conversation. There's no closet, no chest of drawers. Your family's entire wardrobe fits in a wooden box, plus whatever's hanging on pegs near the fire. That box also holds linens, tools, thread, and possibly a half-dead squirrel the cat dragged in last night. The word fashion doesn't exist here. Clothes are function over form always. They keep you warm, barely keep the bugs off sometimes, and soak up your sweat always. You will wear this outfit for months without washing. Maybe you'll air it out near the hearth if it rains. Maybe you want to do laundry. Sure, first haul a bucket of water from the stream. Then heat it over a fire for 2 hours. Then scrub each piece on a wooden board with lye made from ash and animal fat. Then wring it out by hand. Then hang it outside where birds might poop on it. And after all that, you'll probably still smell like burnt cheese and sheep. So no, you don't do laundry, you manage your stink. You glance in the cracked piece of polished metal that serves as a mirror. Your hair is doing something wild. It's probably cleanish since you dumped water on it yesterday. But your face has that soft reddish hue of constant wind exposure and open pore living. Your cheeks sting a little from the cold. Your nose might be trying to fall off. Normal. And let's talk hygiene. You don't own a toothbrush, or toothpaste, or floss. Maybe a rag, maybe a stick, maybe nothing. Your breath. Not great. No one's is. But people are polite about it. No one talks too close. It's an unspoken social agreement.